Hey YouTube, today I am going to talk about an advanced sidechain technique I call the micro sidechain. It uses audio rate modulation as opposed to basic sidechain compression or ducking. I'm going to use this demo project to show an example of how to use this technique to add texture to techno drums. The texture element that is getting micro sidechained is this Foley sample. So I'm going to solo it and the kick sample. And if we remove the Foley sample, you can see we're left with just a basic kick. Now, since this Foley sample is adding texture, it's landing right on top of the kick. So if we were to use just basic sidechain compression, we'd essentially be completely removing this Foley sample or making it really quiet, defeating the purpose. As opposed to basic sidechain compression, micro sidechaining is going to look at a completely different time scale. So as opposed to say like ducking out the audio for this entire region where the kick takes place, or even like, a section of the kick, like the transient, micro sidechaining is going to look at a completely different time scale using audio rate modulation. So we're going to cut out this Foley texture sample when the kick drum is peaking. We're going to pass it through when the kick drum is going through the zero crossing. And not only will this kind of glue these sounds together in a sort of satisfying way, it's going to be optimal in the sense of like mixing, mastering, making the kick loud. Because if you think about it, this kick drum, generally it's going to sit as the loudest element in your mix. But if you add this texture on top, you've all of a sudden lost all this headroom. However loud your Foley is, that's going to be kind of on your mastered bouncing up and down here. So you've lost all this headroom and you either have to engage a limiter or clip it or whatever, but you're basically going to be losing some headroom for your kick drum. All right, so I have an oscilloscope and a limiter set up on the master chain. And I have the limiter set up so it's just barely engaging when the micro sidechaining is enabled, which is this FX grid down here. Now, watch as I turn this on and off, watch as the limiter will engage, which will be shown as this kind of red line getting lower. So you can see when the micro sidechaining is disabled, the texture comes through louder. I mean, there's not the amplitude modulation going on, but all of a sudden on the master, we're losing a lot of headroom, and minus 4.5 dBs of kind of attenuation is being added on our limiter. And it's not just attenuating our Foley sample, this is on the master. So this would be attenuating our kick drum as well. And then if we look over at the scope, you can see there's about 6 decibels of headroom we're losing over here. Let me first quickly run through what actually is the micro sidechaining pipeline, and then we can jump into some theory and talk about like why we have these components. So first off, in Bitwig, this is saying like this is our effects input. So this is our Foley sample coming in, and this is our output. And then down here is our sidechain. So we have the kick coming in. It gets full wave rectified. So it's the same thing as taking the absolute value, or we're kind of like doing this type of wave shaping function. And then we amplify it quite a bit. We invert it. So we flip the polarity. We hard clip it. We add a DC offset of 1. We hard clip it again. And here, let me add a scope at the input. And we're essentially transforming this kick sample to look like that through this processing. And that gives us the signal we need to do audio rate modulation, to do exactly what I talked about, where we sort of let this incoming FX input get passed through when the kick is going through a zero crossing, and it gets cut out, or at least attenuated, when the kick drum is peaking. All right, time to jump over to the theoretical section of the video so we can build some intuition of why we're setting up that Bitwig audio rate modulation pipeline that way in order to achieve micro sidechaining. So first thing I want to talk about is what is audio rate modulation? And this is probably a review for some of you. Some of you, it might be the first time you're actually seeing like theoretically what it's done. It's also known as AM, which is just another name for multiplication. It's really just multiplying these two signals together. So the easiest way to do this, like drawing it, is like when if I go over to the fatter waveform, it kind of makes the fat one an envelope for the higher frequency signal. And you know, I'm not, it's impossible to draw this accurately, but it'll look something like that on the output. Like it's sort of adding this sort of envelope over the original high frequency waveform. So that's what amplitude modulation is. So the next question is, how can we use amplitude modulation to achieve microside chaining? So as I said, what we want to do is pass through the audio during these purple sections, during the zero crossing. We want to let the audio through. And then during these peaks, we want to cut off the audio. And maybe we want to do this proportionally or smoothly, like where we kind of continuously like letting more and more through as we get to the purple, and then letting less and less through as we get to the green, if that makes sense. So this is what we want. We can use amplitude modulation for this and just kind of start at the answer. Like what do we need our amplitude modulation waveform to look like in order to do that? Well, we'd want a waveform that is during these purple parts, we want the waveform to be high. We want it to be at its like maximum value of 1. And then during these green parts, we want the value to be 0. So like let's fill in those points first. So, and then if we just kind of connect the dots and maybe make it look nice and smooth, this is kind of the waveform we want. And then if we were to sort of amplitude modulate this signal with our high frequency source, we'd be getting something like this. And this should kind of like lay on top of where it has a high amplitude when the kick drum is at the 0 crossing, and a low amplitude when the kick drum is at its peak. Like that's kind of the whole idea, right? So this is the waveform we want to be able to process out of our kind of Bitwig or whatever modular system we have. So how can we get this waveform from this waveform? That's the question. So it's just a couple of processes. It's the ones I showed before. First one we want to walk through is rectification. This is full wave rectification. It's the same thing as absolute value in math terms. And what this is going to do is it's going to essentially take the negative parts of our input wave and it's going to flip them and make them positive. So what that'll look like is this. Here. Yeah, so we kind of have these 3 sections of our input waveform, and it is just making them all positive, flipping them over. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's the first operation we're going to do. All right, so believe it or not, we're actually almost there. The only things we need to do now is invert the signal, which really quick, let me add another axis. That will just kind of flip it about the x-axis. So it's the same thing as multiplying the signal by -1. The last step is just DC offset, which is just add 1. And in that stage, I mean, I can just say we're doing both here. So there you have it. That's that waveform I said we wanted to get out of this one in order to do microside chaining. And it's just these 3 operations: rectification, inversion, and DC offset. Oh, and one extra thing I wanted to add. I just used a sine wave in this example because it's easier to draw. But you can do this for any waveform. So let's go build that in Bitwig, and then we're done. All right, so time to build it, and I will start from scratch in case any of you are new to Bitwig. I am new, my first 2 days with it, so bear with me. So we start with the effects, and it gives us this input and this output. And then what we can do is add, I think maybe up here it's faster to look, side chain. Yeah, there we go. Drag this in there. And then we want to make our kick our source. And I guess we can do post. And then let's walk through our pipeline. So the first thing is going to be, let me search for it, it'll be faster. Rectifier. And then this is actually called half wave rectification. The way they have it, it just completely cuts off the negative. What we want to do is keep the negative parts of the waveform, but just flip them positive. So it has that type of wave shape. And then what's the next thing? I'm actually going to, let's start scoping this out so we can see what it looks like. Maybe I can solo the kick for right now. Okay, so we've done the full wave rectification. Next, we can put in, what was the next thing I said? I think it's invert. So they either call it invert, yeah, they do call it invert, or you can just multiply by -1. So if I put this in, now in our scope, it should show us the opposite. And then what's our last thing? We need to add. I can't remember if they call it DC offset or add. I think it's just add. Or bias should be the same thing. Maybe bias will be easier. Yeah, it looks like bias at 100% is the same as adding 1. And then here's where I want to point out a kind of a caveat or a problem with this. When I was walking through the theory, I was kind of assuming that our input signal was already normalized or had kind of a maximum value of 1. We can't really like assume that with the audio sidechain. So there will need to be like one control that, you know, a mixing engineer would need to learn how to use. And I'm going to do level and gain. I guess any gain will work. And I'm going to put it before the inversion like this. And a couple other problems you can see when you do this, you can all of a sudden start to get some negative values, and we don't really want our amplitude modulation to ever really have negative values. That's not the point of this chain. So this is why I'm going to add those hard clips in, and let me just remind myself where I had those. I had it after the inversion and after the last one. And that makes sure we never exceed 1 and we never exceed, or we never go below 0. So let me just look up clip. And can I just duplicate that? Yeah, there we go. So now even when we completely turn this kind of gain control all the way up, we never start doing negative amplitude modulation. And to kind of properly use this tool as I have described it, you do want to have your peaks up to be hitting where they're kind of getting levels at 0, because 0 is where you're going to be completely choking off the audio. So this will make sure that your micro sidechain will be completely clamping the audio. And then, you can always pull it back if you want to have this effect more subtle or turn the mix down. So now if we plug this back in, this should function just like the one I was demoing at the beginning. Oh, right, I need to unmute this. Oh, it's definitely not, because I did something stupid. I forgot to do the amplitude modulation. Let's do multiply, I think it's called, yeah. And then this will be one of our multiplies. That's our other multiply, and then that goes right to our output. Now we can listen to it. Okay, so that's with the mix all the way up. When I was kind of playing around with this, I found this was best with the mix around here, which means you are taking away a little bit of headroom with the signal. You're not completely choking it off at the kick's peaks, but it just sounds a little bit nice to have a little bit of that texture stay throughout the the duration. And yeah, let me do these side by side. Okay, sounds more or less the same. So I think we definitely were able to recreate it. I can also show you what this gain control does. And let me put the scope back on. So you can see when you really start crushing it, like this is not a linear operation at all. I mean, you're doing amplitude modulation. It's really more of a sound design thing than a mixing thing. And let me even duplicate this and like really crush this. Let's take this to the extreme. Did that work? I think that worked. All right, well, I think you get the point. When I crank that gain up, it gets really crunchy very quickly. This is obviously not a linear process. It does add a lot of distortion, which is part of the cool things about it, I think, because the way you're distorting the waveform is related to the kick. It's actually like mathematically true. You'd be putting some harmonics from the kick into the Foley sample or into whatever your sidechain target is. That's because there's this like one fact in DSP that multiplication in the time domain is the same as convolution in the frequency domain. So it's like you're convolving the frequencies of the processed kick with the frequencies of your texture. So that's kind of cool. You're sort of gluing things together, making them sound as one unit by like gluing their frequencies together. That said, what I just mentioned definitely would have a risk of aliasing. In fact, I'm almost sure I would be aliasing. I don't know how to do oversampling in Bitwig, but if you know how to make your FX grid do oversampling, I think that's probably necessary to not, to make this as optimal or clean sounding as you can. All right, so we've done all the hard work for this video. I always like to end the videos on a kind of fun note. I guess we can kind of just like go through my sample library, or at least the samples I've gotten into Bitwig so far, and just kind of play around with different Foley samples, adding different textures to the drums. I'll mute the synth loops for now so we can just focus on the drums. And yeah, let's just have some fun. Let me make sure I loop this. Oh no, I'm still learning Bitwig. That last one was cool. What was that? Wood chimes. second. All right, there we go. I want a 4-step because I think that was just a happy accident what was just going on when I was previewing, but I liked it. I had an idea. Let's do this. Well, I'm clearly not skilled enough in Bitwig at this to not keep on messing up, but that's all right. I guess I'll leave it at here. I hope you enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making it. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to give it a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you next time.